handled by someone with a grievance who has easy access to weapons of war. The world as it is a place where we tolerate human beings living in tents and sleeping under bridges, while we watch the average rent in Washington, D.C. climb to $2,300 a month. The world as it is a place where state legislatures pass laws to ban access to health care and bathrooms and sports for transgender kids, instead of protecting some of the most vulnerable among us. The world as it is a place where American cities like Jackson, Mississippi, and Flint, Michigan, still don't have clean drinking water. And I could go on and on, but I know that I don't need to. Because we live in this world. We listen to the news. We are well aware of the world as it is, that it is a messy place where power and resources are distributed unequally and where self-interest runs amok. And when we live in this tension between the world as it is and the world as it should be, we have two choices. We can choose to think that nothing will ever change, that suffering and injustice are inevitable, or we can organize. We can act. We can become the change we wish to see in the world. And like many of us, I choose action because it has long been a spiritual practice for me to refuse to accept suffering, especially suffering that comes of our own making. Suffering that could be wholly preventable if only we had enough courage and collective will. And I call it a spiritual practice because it is grounded deeply in our faith tradition. We worship a God who is on the side of the vulnerable, who calls people to justice and compassion. So much of the suffering in this world is, as the prophets of the Bible tell us, offensive to God. And if we are truly living as God's people in the world, then we are trying to do something about it. I have never understood or been persuaded by a theology that seems to suggest that human suffering is God's will or the punishment for sins. And I certainly don't believe that Jesus' crucifixion was somehow necessary in order to appease God's anger at the depravity of humanity. Are you with me? Okay. And I think this is why we as so many good progressive Christians struggle to embrace the cross. It's why we shy away from this part of the story of Jesus between the hosannas and the hallelujahs, because it pains us to see Christ begging God to spare him from the cup of suffering, from the humiliating brutality of the crucifixion, to see that God seems to be unmoved. Jesus is going to die, and not just any death, but the death of a criminal of the state. His hands and feet nailed to a cross until he suffocates. What kind of God would allow this, let alone require it? How can we accept such suffering as part of the story of a good and loving God? As we have made our way through this season of Lent and our journey of grief, we have explored the stages of grief that were named by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross: denial, anger, bargaining, depression. And we acknowledge that the experience of grief is not limited to just death and dying. Nor is this journey linear. We don't process through these stages of grief and check off boxes one by one. And yet at some point, we hopefully will reach a place of acceptance with our grief. A place where we will not say, I'm okay with what happened, my loved one's death, my terminal illness, my divorce, the suffering of the world. But I accept this reality. And I know that I can continue to move forward with my life. This grief is a part of me now, a part of the story that I tell about my life. And death and suffering and pain and loss do not have the final word. We reach a stage of acceptance with our grief when we stop fighting the pain and we make some peace with it. And this Kubler-Ross was a psychologist, who spent years with the terminally ill and dying. She observed how they faced the experience of death and how those around them treated them. And she contrasted her experience of growing up in Switzerland, where people died at home, surrounded by loved ones, where death and dying was a part of the culture, with what she saw here in America, where people who were dying were sent to hospitals, and they were alone. She urged us as a society to embrace this part of life, of death and loss and suffering, and to be with people who were going through it in a ministry of presence. And still, she acknowledged that the experience of suffering, whether it is our own or someone else's, is extremely difficult. She wrote, "The belief has long died that suffering here on earth will be rewarded in heaven. Suffering has lost its meaning," she wrote. In our scripture reading from Luke's Gospel, we meet Jesus at a place of suffering. On the night before he dies, he is going through what seems like all the stages of grief all at once. He's in denial, telling the disciples to pray that they will not come into the time of trial, when he knows that this time of trial is coming soon. He wrestles with God in prayer, with sweat dripping from his body like an athlete trying to wrestle God to the ground. And he bargains, asking God to please allow this cup of suffering to pass him by. And he grieves as he watches his closest friends fall asleep, and not even able to stay awake with them for one night because they are so overcome with grief. And ultimately, Jesus reaches a stage of acceptance. "Not my will," he says, "but yours be done." And then Jesus gets up and faces what is to come. Kubler-Ross observed that the people who had experienced greater suffering in their lives, the people who were not insulated from struggles of poverty or pain or loss, who lived their lives with a sense of acceptance and purpose, found it easier to face their own deaths with dignity and peace. She believed that those who went through their lives trying to control the world around them, with money and power and influence, struggled more to accept the stage of life that is coming for us all. Jesus lived his whole life, knowing that his purpose was to serve God, to embody God's love and to point people towards the kingdom, to stand up for injustice and to proclaim liberation for those who are oppressed. And he knew that this kind of life and this kind of good news would threaten those who cling to power, and it could cost him his life. And so he had acceptance at the end. He had done what God called him to do, and he would continue to the end. It is not that God required Jesus to suffer and die, but he knew that if he was going to live in a way that confronted the world, for the sake of the world as it should be, that suffering was bound to be part of that path. As Clinton McCann writes, Jesus' prayer for God's will to be done is not a request to suffer and die, as though God intended such. Rather, Jesus prays for the strength and the courage to witness to the justice, righteousness, and peace that God wills. And if that means facing deadly opposition, so be it. To live in the tension of the world as it is and the world as it should be means that suffering will be part of our journey as well. We will not be able to deny or avoid it. We cannot relieve all the suffering in the world or in our families or in our communities or even in ourselves. And sometimes as we seek to create change, we will bring additional suffering. But to aid us in the acceptance of this reality, perhaps the words of the Serenity Prayer may be of some use to us. You may know that this prayer was written by Reinhold Niebuhr in 1934. He wrote several versions of it, and it became much more well known when it was adopted by Alcoholics Anonymous and other 12-step programs. If you know it, you may want to say it with me. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. And here is the rest of the prayer. Living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardships as the pathway to peace, taking, as Jesus did, this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it. Trusting that God will make all things right if I surrender to God's will, that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with God forever in the next. Perhaps Dr. Kubler-Ross is right, that suffering has lost its meaning if we think it's only about enduring in order to earn some heavenly reward. But what if through acceptance of suffering as a part of life, as a part of striving for justice, as a part of living faithfully, what if accepting suffering as something we can learn and grow from? What if that could lead us to a deeper sense of peace? A peace with God who is with us in all things, including our pain and our grief. That is a joyful question. I asked someone I know well who has been doing the work of recovery for a long time what they thought about this prayer, and this is what they told me. Acceptance to me is facing up to everything. Not just the things I can change, but everything as it is. I pray to accept reality and not live in denial, loosening my grip on misplaced responsibility, and letting God do the work that is beyond my best scheme. I can obtain immense relief in that alone. I may also be afforded opportunities, finding things I can change, loving unconditionally, and being grateful. May it be so. Beloved, I invite you to reflect on all of this. On this story of Jesus' suffering, on your suffering, on the suffering of the world. And I invite you to fold a palm into the shape of a cross. You can come and get one of these, or I can bring one to you. Stefan is going to play a little bit of music for us, and the instructions on how to fold a palm cross, if you don't know, are in your bulletin. The branches you waved on the way in, unfortunately, won't work. So you have to get one of these.